is my channel, The Fancy Hat Lady Reads. I don't think I've ever worn this headdress for one of my Halloween booktube videos before, even though I've owned it for years, so it is time. And this year, I am doing an autumn vibes fantasy book recommendations video. Not necessarily spooky, not necessarily scary. I have made the genre decision to exclude things that I think are actually horror and not fantasy predominantly as their primary genre. Though some of these do have a spooky, scary element to them. I'm trying to encompass the full range of autumn vibes, from the spooky creepy to the old libraries, academia, cozy coffee shop, all of that. I've pulled this list together by pulling books off of my shelves. So this is all things that I own copies of. They are all things that I believe I rated 4 or 5 stars, but things that I don't own physically, that I got from the library or read on ebook, aren't gonna make this list. But a lot of these are older books, and a lot of these are things that I read years ago. So I am going on fuzzy memories for a bunch of these for why I feel they are autumnal, but that's also kind of part of why I wanted to do this recommendations video, is to pull out all the old books and let them have a moment to shine in a booktube video. I'm going to do this by age category, so I'm going to start with middle grade, I'm going to move on to YA, and then I'm going to have adult books last, and the majority of the books that I have here are going to be adult. But starting with middle grade, Castle Hangnail by Ursula Vernon. I feel like this is kind of self-explanatory, but I don't hear people talking about this book anymore, even though Ursula Vernon is very popular right now under her T. Kingfisher pen name. This is about a young witch who becomes mistress of a spooky castle. It is illustrated by the author. Next, I'm going to recommend the whole Fairyland series by Catherynne and Valente, but specifically The Girl Who Circumnavigated Fairyland in a Ship of Her Own Making, the first book in this series. The protagonist's name is September, so that's reason number 1. Secondly, I remember this book having several chapters in the latter half that focused heavily on the concept of autumn. There is, flipping through this gorgeous illustration for a chapter called Autumn is the Kingdom Where Everything Changes. But even beyond that, just the vibes of this whole series have this sort of cozy curl up with an elaborate whimsical fantasy type of feel that I associate with autumn reading vibes. I think those were my only 2 very clearly, obviously middle grade books. These next 2 are books that, in the US at least, get shelved as YA, but they have sort of upper middle grade, lower YA crossover. They are both by Frances Hardinge. The first is Cuckoo Song, and the second is The Lie Tree. This is the older of the 2 books, but it's the one I read most recently. I read this last year for Halloween vibes reading. These are both historical. This one, I want to say it takes place in the 1920s, and this one is 19th century. To me, historical fantasy often has an autumnal vibe. I don't know what it is about thinking about the past that makes me think of fall. Take that however you want. Cuckoo Song starts out very spooky to me, in the sense that the character, the protagonist, doesn't understand what's going on, and so there is this mystery of things being deeply, deeply unsettling and something being wrong, and the character doesn't know what. After that mystery gets resolved, I found the rest of the book to be less spooky, but it's also a sort of fae fantasy in a way that feels seasonally appropriate to me. And then The Lie Tree I read much longer ago, but it also, I I remember it having these sort of dark psychological atmosphere to it that I think is very appropriate for fall. Also YA, I have The Hazel Wood by Melissa Albert. This now has a sequel that I haven't read, but this, I remember feeling like it worked perfectly well as a standalone. This is a contemporary YA fantasy with like spooky dark fairy tales that turn out to be real. I'm putting Tamsin by Peter S. Beagle in the YA category because my edition is from Firebird Fantasy, which doesn't exist anymore, but I believe when they existed, they were a YA publisher. I don't know who, if anyone, publishes this now, and if they publish it as YA, but this is totally an appropriate book for teen readers. The protagonist is a teenager dealing with teenage stuff. This was published in 1999, and it was contemporary for the time it was published. It is a ghost story, however, and so it also delves into the history of the time period that the ghost Tamsin is from. This is one of those books that's a ghost story without being like spooky in the Halloween sense, but it does have some folklore as well as that history that feels autumnal to me. As you can tell by the cover, it has cats in it, both a living cat and a ghost cat, and it's also just a character study of this teenage girl at an emotionally tumultuous time in her life. The next book here is my bridge between the YA section of this video and the adult section of this video. This is The Seventh Bride by T. Kingfisher, which was published, I think, as an adult title from 47 North, although to me this reads much more like her YA and middle grade stuff that she publishes under this name. Like, it feels more like A Wizard's Guide to Defensive Baking or Minor Mage or Summer in Orcus to me than it feels like her other adult work. It doesn't read as young as something like Castle Hangnail, though. But this is a Bluebeard retelling, and it does have some like intensely creepy moments, but I think they're intensely creepy in an age-appropriate way for younger readers. Moving into the adult books proper with Morte Kingfisher, this one is the only really new recent book on this list, and this is A Sorceress Comes to Call, which came out a couple months ago. I had previously thought of The Seventh Bride as being a very loose Bluebeard retelling, but this is like an even looser Goose Girl retelling, to the point where I almost hesitate to lead with calling it a Goose Girl retelling. The fairy tale influence is there, but you kind of have to look for it. To me, this feels like a story where something much creepier and more sinister starts happening to characters in a Fantasy of Manners world than a Fantasy of Manners would normally be equipped to handle, and that's where like the spookiness and tension of it comes from. But I think it only really takes that sense of danger so far. Like, there's a certain point at which all hell does not break loose and it does not become a horror novel. There are two main protagonists. One of them is very young and one of them is middle-aged, and the villainess of the book, who is the sorceress of the title, is the younger character's mother. Next, I want to recommend a couple of novellas if you're looking for something short. First, Uncommon Charm by Emily Bergslien and Kat Weaver. This is another one that is a ghost story but isn't creepy, spooky, scary. The tone of this is much more bittersweet family history. It's also historical 1920s. Of Sorrow and Such by Angela Slater is a witchy dark fantasy. This is about a woman who is a witch in a small village and some other magical women, and what happens when they get in trouble with the local authorities. This is a sort of darker, grittier book about surviving difficult situations. Angela Slater also writes novels set in this same world that a bunch of her short fiction is also set in, but the novels are published under the name A.G. Slater. The ones that I have read are All the Murmuring Bones and The Path of Thorns. These are both dark fantasy novels with gothic influences. I think both of these border on horror. I think especially The Path of Thorns borders on gothic horror, but because these are set in an elaborate fantasy world as opposed to in some version of the real world, I feel like they are predominantly dark fantasy as opposed to horror novels. This one is about a young woman escaping her creepy family with their decaying fortunes, and this one is about a governess with a secret agenda. Veering away from the creepy books into something that is probably the most like traditional fantasy series on this list, I'm going to recommend Witchmark by C.L. Polk. This is the first book in the Kingston cycle, which is a trilogy that becomes, by the end, a very politically driven, elaborate fantasy story, but starts off with, I think, a much smaller scope and smaller cast of characters in book one. Each of them has a queer romance. I think this one is more romance-centered than the second two books, but the seasonality of this story is very prominent in all three books, and this is the one that takes place in autumn. I remember like apples being a big thing in this book, and the second two books, Storm Song and Soul Star, both take place in winter, so like the snow and the winter weather are very prominent in those books, whereas this one is like the autumn vibes book. So if you want to read this trilogy seasonally, I would say start this book now in the fall, and then when winter comes, read books 2 and 3. These next two books I am recommending because they are books that I would want to like curl up with like blankets and hot chocolate on a crisp or maybe a rainy fall day if I were going to like choose my perfect mood to reread these books. The first is Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. I went back and forth as to whether I would also include Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell on this list because I think both of her novels have a kind of like academic obsession to them that feels very autumnal because we associate academia with the fall and back to school, but neither of them is like a school setting book. This is the one of the two that I ultimately chose for this list though, because it's a very like mysterious book. You start reading it, you have no idea what's going on, and you eventually piece it together, and that sort of mystery and like intense atmosphere is something that I associate with autumnal reads. And then another book that I feel has really similar vibes is The Starless Sea by Erin Morgenstern. This also has like library vibes, which I feel like is a big autumn thing, and also like layered stories, books within books, fairy tale landscapes, like getting lost in fairy tale landscapes, stories within stories. All of those things are fall vibes for me, and this book is a lot. It's a lot of that. Like, read this if all of that sounds good and you want all of that, but like so much of it. So much of it. Not in moderation. Next is Sunshine by Robin McKinley, which I think is the only vampire book on the list. But it's not on the list because it's a vampire book. It's on the list because it's a coffee shop book. I feel like this is a book that is continuously overlooked in our discussion of like the origins of cozy fantasy. Like, this is definitely a vampire novel where a lot of bad things happen, but also the protagonist spends a significant amount of time in this book baking cinnamon rolls in a coffee shop. Next, I've got a book that is on this list because it is both gothic and extremely mysterious. Very what the heck is going on, a little bit unsettling, and that is Under the Pendulum Sun by Jeannette. This is a gothic fantasy novel set in the Fairyland. Again, it's historical 19th century, and I think like both the combination of like Fae and 19th century along with gothic, and also like very intellectual. There's a lot of theology in this. All of these things are very autumn vibes coded for me. Again, a book I read a really long time ago and I've forgotten a lot of details about, but it had to be on this list. And then for my very last book, I wanted to make sure I included a short story collection. And this one is A Cathedral of Myth and Bone by Kat Howard. Now, I don't remember a lot of the stories in this collection specifically, but some of the themes running through it have to do with like sainthood, both sort of real world Catholicism-ish and also like fantasy world sainthood. And there's a lot of sort of like creepy relics and bones and stuff that goes along with that. Also, I definitely do remember the longest story in this collection. It's called Once Future. It's a novella and it's an Arthurian thing that takes place on a college campus, so it has the academia. I think there might also be one or two other Arthurian influenced stories in this. There's definitely whimsy in some of these stories, but also some darkness. I do wish I remembered more of the stories in this book in detail, but this was published in, gosh, when was this published? 2018, and I think I read it pretty shortly after that. I maybe read this in 2019. I think it was one of the first books on my booktube channel that I ever like failed to actually ever put in a wrap-up, and I've sort of been feeling bad about it ever since, even though I've failed to wrap up many books since then. But this is still a story collection I think about every now and again and think, oh, I liked that story collection. I wish I'd managed to do a real review of it. Anyhow, that is the end of this list. I wanted it to be a big list with something for everyone. Let me know if you've read any of these books, if you think they're autumnal, if you have other ideas about what sort of autumnal fantasy reads you want to pick up this time of year. Anyhow, I hope you're having a very nice day. That is all. Bye for now.